The Trump administration has proposed a sharp limit on federal authority to regulate water pollution. This is Trump on Earth. I'm Julie Grant. When President Trump started his tenure, he promised to repeal something called the Waters of the U.S. rule.
Has sort of a nice name, but everything else is bad.
It was a clarification of the Clean Water Act by the Obama administration.
I've been hearing about it for years and years. I didn't know I'd necessarily be in this position to do something about it.
Almost since the beginning of the Clean Water Act in 1972, there have been legal battles over which bodies of water, which wetlands, which tributaries to the nation's rivers should be regulated by the federal government. There were two relatively recent U.S. Supreme Court rulings on this issue in 2001 and 2006. Gina McCarthy, EPA administrator under President Obama, says those rulings left unclear which bodies of water were covered under the Clean Water Act. The justices ordered the EPA to write new regulations. They spent years assessing all the available science.
We went out and we looked at 1,500 peer-reviewed studies. We started out a science advisory board peer review panel that said, okay, how do we get more robust in the science? They did a report for us.
McCarthy says the Obama EPA received over 1 million public comments about its proposed rule. But it never actually took effect. States that didn't like it filed suit, and it was stopped in the courts. Now, the Trump administration wants to drastically cut federal authority over streams and wetlands, and there's concern about the impact this would have on drinking water, aquatic life, and flood control provided by these wetlands and streams. With us to talk about this is Ariel Wittenberg, who covers the Clean Water Act for E&E News. Hi, Ariel.
Hi.
And we should mention you're connected with us via Skype. Thanks for joining us. So Andrew Wheeler, the acting EPA administrator, made this announcement about the Clean Water Rule. How did he introduce the Trump version of this rule, and what are the major changes here?
So the Trump administration is basing their regulation on a 2006 Supreme Court opinion from Justice Antonin Scalia. And he said that only relatively permanent waters or relatively permanent wetlands with surface water connections to those waters should be covered by the Clean Water Act. So what that means is if you have a tributary that only flows after it rains, Scalia wouldn't say that that's covered. If you have a wetland, even if it's actually really wet, but the water from the wetland doesn't connect to a river or to a tributary, Scalia would also say that's not covered under the Clean Water Act, and that's essentially what this Trump rule aligns with.
So the Trump rule is using Justice Antonin Scalia's take on what should be regulated.
Exactly, and that's a departure from both the Obama and Bush administrations, which used an opinion from Justice Anthony Kennedy in the same case for their regulations.
And that was a significant nexus?
Right. So Kennedy's opinion is a little bit different. He would cover wetlands and streams that have this surface water connection, but he would go farther than that. He would also cover wetlands and streams that have biological, chemical, or hydrological nexuses to larger downstream waterways. So if there's a subsurface water connection, Kennedy, Obama, and Bush might cover the wetland. If you can show that something that's polluted in this wetland will make its way to a covered stream, that's the significant nexus that Kennedy's looking for, and Obama and the Bush administrations would cover it, even if it's not a direct, obvious surface water connection all the time.
Yeah, and this may be neither here nor there, but it's interesting that Supreme Court justices are are the ones leading these administrative decisions that are so scientifically based.
Well, certainly Kennedy's decision shows like a baseline understanding of science of how wetlands work and how streams work and how they're all connected. A lot of people would argue that Scalia really isn't based in science. What he does is he looks at the plain text of the rule of the Clean Water Act. So Scalia looks at the plain text of the Clean Water Act, and he literally looked up the word waters in the dictionary. And essentially, that's what he based his decision on.
So in the announcement, EPA Administrator Wheeler said that the agency does not know how many streams would no longer be regulated by the federal government if the proposed rule takes effect. But you've reported that that's not right. What did you find?
Right. So that's not true at all. We found through a Freedom of Information Act, we found these documents that the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA staffers had prepared back in 2017 to brief then EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt on, here's how many different kinds of streams or here's how many different kinds of wetlands exist in the country. And if you take that presentation and look at it now, knowing that the Trump administration's rule does not cover what we call ephemeral streams that only flow after rainfall, well, we see in this data that accounts for at least 18% of streams nationwide. So at least 18% of streams nationwide are not going to be covered by the Trump rule. Similarly, also sort of looking at the slides and comparing it to the actual rule text, the rule would only cover wetlands with a direct surface water connection to streams that have intermittent and perennial flows. That means that 51% of the nation's wetlands, more than half, will not be covered by this rule.
And how did the agency respond once you brought this to their attention, that the EPA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, had previously had these numbers available?
So the agency, EPA, has continued to say that they don't have the data. I think that that's sort of a misinterpretation, if you will, of what they have. They have data. It's not perfect, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't use it. So, for example, this 18% of streams in the country are ephemeral. If we look at that, that's based on maps that the U.S. Geological Survey does of all of the streams in the country.
When you say an ephemeral stream, what are you talking about?
So an ephemeral stream is a stream that it's dry most of the time, but after it rains or after it snows, it fills with water and there is a flow. And so that can sound insignificant to people who aren't familiar with specific waterways that fall into these categories. But a lot of them, they'll be bone dry. And then when it rains, you'll just see these rushes of water that anyone looking at them would say, oh, yeah, that looks like a stream to me. So it really has been this category that's been debated, for decades because of that.
So this new rule would take the ephemeral streams out of the jurisdiction of the federal government for a regulation.
Yes.
And so what's at stake here? How might this impact drinking water, habitat for fish and other aquatic life, and also the ecosystem services that we hear about, things like flood control that wetlands provide?
So there's a lot at stake here. Wetlands, generally speaking, can provide all sorts of important ecological services from, like you mentioned, absorbing floodwaters. They absorb stormwater when it rains. And when they're absorbing it, they also, because they're holding the stormwater in and oftentimes just letting it trickle out into streams or rivers that might be far away from them, they're also filtering out any kind of pollutants that might be in the water while they're holding it in. So that's a really important impact of wetlands. And they also, of course, serve as habitat for species. Wading birds, for example, love these kinds of seasonally shallow wetlands that are going to be completely excluded from the Trump proposal.
And what about the reduction in the number of streams that are covered?
So the stream aspect is important in a couple of ways. You're not going to find a town that has its drinking water impact in a stream that isn't constantly flowing, because how would you run your town that way? But there are a lot of drinking water intakes that are downstream of those ephemeral streams and that, contribute a lot of water to the downstream rivers, and also it's clean water that they're contributing. So if you then don't include them in the Clean Water Act, and you're in a state that doesn't have protections for these streams, you could have someone build a building in this, what looks like most of the time dry land, that then the building could end up being flooded whenever it rains. Or you could have someone place a coal ash pond in this, what looks like most of the time dry lands. And then when it rains, not only is it flooded, but potentially pollutants from the coal ash trickle down into where there might be a drinking water intake or, a fishing spot that people like downstream.
And I just want to go back to the wetland issue because, I remember hearing after Hurricane Harvey in Houston last year that one of the big issues was all the building that had taken place on wetlands, and that there just wasn't the flood, that if they were to protect the wetlands more, they would have had so much more ability to control some of the water. Now, this was a lot of water that came quickly, so maybe they would never have been able to control it, but they would have had a better chance.
Jim Blackburn of Rice University has studied the effects of storms on cities for nearly 40 years. He says when Harvey came ashore, the storm laid bare another problem decades in the making: the massive paving over of the area's natural wetlands and prairies.
We've covered our sponge up.
Harvey, there was just an insane amount of rain that no community would be able to fully, respond to. So it was a natural disaster. But at the same time, there are aspects of it that were man-made. Because when you pave over a wetlands, not only are you eliminating this extra good natural sponge to absorb these stormwaters, but you're also, in the case of Houston, paving over it with an impervious surface where the water is just going to sit there and keep growing because there isn't a natural outlet that, even if you had more lawns or a forest, can also, absorb some of these kinds of waters when it rains that much.
As we heard, the Waters of the U.S. rule, that was the version of the rule created under the Obama EPA, was based on something around 1,500 scientific studies assessed by a scientific panel. What is the scientific underpinning of this proposed Trump rule?
Right. So the Obama administration, that connectivity report was more than 300 pages, and it was peer reviewed, and then they had a scientific advisory board also look at it, and the advisory board upheld its findings. It wasn't a policy document, so it didn't say in this connectivity report, here's what should be protected by the Clean Water Act. But in the actual Obama rule, you'll see them citing this connectivity report to say, here's a wetland that maybe geographically looks really far away from a river, but we know how pollutants that get into this wetland can make their way into the river, right? The Trump administration has not done its own report, but they didn't throw out the Obama connectivity report or the science either. They're not saying it's inaccurate. Basically, what they're saying is this is a legal question. It's a question of what does the Clean Water Act extend to? And we think the Obama administration drew the line in the wrong place. Again, they're not throwing out the science. They're more like trying to sidestep it a little bit.
And we know that when the Obama rule came out, and after that, many farmers, we heard from builders and developers, did not like the Obama rule. And then EPA Secretary Gina McCarthy said the rule was really just misunderstood.
We actually expanded exemptions for agriculture, and still, on the basis of gut instinct, everybody decided that it was worse than it ever was before. The fact that we clarified it and we're actually going to do it right became a threat.
Why was that so poorly received by the Obama administration? And I guess to go on with that, some are calling the Trump administration rule kind of a giveaway to special interests, including farmers, builders, and also the shale gas industry. Why?
Right. So let's talk about the consequences of what happens if you want to build something in a wetland that's covered by the Clean Water Act. You have to get a permit. And getting a permit requires potentially paying for consultants to help you, fill out the permit, but you're also going to have to do what's called mitigation. So if you destroy an acre of wetlands that's covered by the Clean Water Act, you have to pay to restore or preserve similar wetlands to basically offset the impacts to the watershed. You don't see Clean Water Act permits that are denied. It's a very, very minuscule number that are totally denied. So this is really a question of money when it comes to building in wetlands, destroying wetlands in that way.
I see. So it's just that they have to pay to have experts come in and make sure that where they're doing it is a place that they can do it without doing too much ecosystem harm, or if they are, protecting the. Right. Well, so that's if you're going to build in a wetland. If you are the consequences are potentially different if you're going to, for example, build a factory and have your wastewater go out in a pipe. That requires a different kind of permit that you wouldn't need if your pipe is now going to be pointing into an ephemeral stream. You just wouldn't need that permit at all. Right. So that's what I wanted to ask, is to go on and say what's about to change, or what would change under the Trump rule.
So under the Trump rule, you could see more just overall destruction of wetlands. And that could be sped up because you wouldn't have this permitting process. And you could also see, what we call point sources, which are like pipes with pollution feeding into waterways. You could see those in these ephemeral features without permits, without limits on what they're putting out into the environment.
And the Safe Drinking Water Act, how does that would still protect drinking water?
Right. So the Clean Water Act only applies to surface water. The Safe Drinking Water Act mostly talks about when stuff is coming out of your tap at the tap level, what are the level of pollutants that can be in there. And a lot of places will draw their drinking water from groundwater, and that's really an issue that's left up to the states to regulate. But what we're talking about for drinking water, and in this specifically, is, for example, Toledo, their drinking water intake is in Lake Erie. So anything that goes into Lake Erie that shouldn't be coming out at the tap of people and homes in Toledo, the city of Toledo has to pay more to remove those pollutants, remove those toxins from the drinking water.
What's the response when people say this is really just kind of a giveaway to drillers, to farmers, to developers? Are there other takes on why the administration is doing this?
So what the administration will say is that we are not eliminating all protections for these waterways. We are leaving it up to the states to decide whether they are protected. But the federal government isn't going to do it. In a place like Florida, in a place like California, those are states that already have pretty strong protections of a lot of these waterways we're talking about and wetlands that we're talking about. But in a place like North Carolina, for example, a lot of states in the West, they don't have these kinds of levels of protections for wetlands and streams. In fact, there are a number of states that their regulations for wetlands are directly tied to the federal standard. So if the federal government isn't going to cover it, the states aren't going to cover it. And that's an inconvenient fact for the Trump administration that they haven't really confronted yet.
So what are the next steps for the Trump rule?
So this rule has to be published in the Federal Register, which can take a couple of weeks. Once it is, there are going to be 60 days that the public can submit comments to the administration telling them what they think. They're also planning to hold at least one public hearing on this. And then the Trump administration is going to have to read all of the comments. They're going to have to address them all and come out with a final rule. That's not the end of the road for this. I can say with 100% certainty that someone is going to sue them over this regulation. And then it's going to be up to the courts to decide, number one, did they correctly interpret the Clean Water Act? And number two, a lot of these legal challenges we've seen generally on Trump administration environmental regulations is just, did they follow the laws about when you can change the rules for these things?
All right, well, we'll be watching here. Ariel Wittenberg, who covers the Clean Water Act for E&E News. She joined us via Skype. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. You can find us online at trumponearth.org or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you like our show, please rate and review us and tell a friend about us. Our show is produced by Andy Cubis. I'm Julie Grant.